In America's Great Plains states, UFO sightings have been occurring for well over a century and a half, with cowboys and farmers going on record as witnessing bizarre and mysterious occurrences. Here we look at two still unexplained reports from some of those 19th century witnesses. The vanishing. Strange airborne craft seen in the sky first became known as flying saucers in the late 1940s, but long before that, the distinctive saucer shape was spotted, as on Friday, June 6, 1884. A cowboy named John W. Ellis and 3 others were doing an annual roundup of cattle on a remote ranch, which was about 35 miles northwest of Benkelman, Nebraska. The cowboys later reported that they had seen a flying saucer crash into a nearby ravine. The incident was covered in 2 local newspapers of that time, both the Nebraska Nugget and the Daily State Journal of Lincoln, Nebraska. Describing the area where the crash occurred, the Nugget reported that the surrounding country was rather wild and rough, with roads barely more than trails. The men's cattle roundup was suddenly interrupted when they heard, quote, a terrific whirring noise in the sky above them, and looking up, observed a blazing streak of light shooting downwards towards the ground. They later described the object as a cylindrical airship, which was about 50 or 60 feet long and 10 or 12 feet wide. It appeared to be composed of an unfamiliar metal, which they later realised was extremely light. The blazing cylinder had struck the earth some distance away from the cowboys, who were unable to see exactly where it had crashed, as it had plummeted into a deep ravine. Ellis, a well-known ranchman, and his men turned their horses and took off in search of the crash site, which moments later they found. The newspapers reported that they discovered wreckage of a very strange appearance. Perhaps describing the debris in terms familiar to people of the day, they related that they found fragments of cogwheels and other bits of machinery lying on the ground, and which had been scattered in the path made by the fallen object. These fragments were glowing with heat so intense that the grass was scorched for a long distance around each piece, making it impossible for anyone to approach it. Further description was provided about the wreckage that one piece looked like the blade of a propeller, appearing made of metal like brass and about 16 inches wide, 3 inches thick and 3.5 feet long. It was later picked up with a spade and found not to weigh more than 5 pounds, although appearing as strong and compact as any known metal. A scrap from a seeming wheel, which had a milled rim and would have had a diameter of 7 or 8 feet, was also retrieved. This appeared to be made of the same material and also had the same remarkable lightness. Interestingly, other reported UFO crashes occurring many decades later often involved descriptions of extremely light metals. As an example, in the alleged 1947 crash of a UFO near Roswell in New Mexico, witnesses reported seeing pieces of a metal that was very lightweight and flexible, but also very strong. After observing the crash, the 4 cowboys rode closer to the still-burning object, reaching the edge of the deep ravine into which it had fallen. They tried to make out what it was, but the heat was so intense that the air around it was virtually on fire and emitted a light so dazzling that the human eye could not view it for more than a second. One of the cowboys, named Alf Williamson, dismounted and approached the wreckage site. Coming to within 200 feet of the blazing morass, he raised his head over the edge of the ravine, but within 30 seconds he collapsed senseless from gazing at it from too close a proximity. His hair had been, quote, singed to a crisp, and his face become covered with blisters. The injured man was dragged away from the blazing hot area and conveyed to Ellis's house, where he was cared for until a physician arrived to treat his wounds. His condition was assessed as serious, and his brother in Denver was summoned by telegraph. His experience is one of the first accounts of someone being harmed during a UFO encounter, and although his injuries were described as heat-related, radiation may have also been involved. Others who approached the wreckage may have later suffered radiation-related illnesses and even death. Observing from a safe distance, the remaining cowboys noted that the ground around the UFO had been strangely impacted by the crash. The Nebraska Nugget reported that when the object first touched the earth, the ground had been sandy and bare of grass. Now the sand was fused molten to an unknown depth, covering a space about 20 feet by 30 feet, and the melted substance was still bubbling and hissing. There were several similar spots where it had hit the ground also so affected. It should be remembered that the only air travel known in 1884 was in hot air balloons, contraptions that had no engines and few mechanical parts. It is unlikely that the crash of a balloon would have caused such extreme heat or radiation, or would have scattered so many pieces of strange metallic machinery all around the crash site. Another incongruity was the intense light that continued to shine long after the crash. Come nightfall, many residents of neighbouring ranches ventured to the crash site to see the mysterious object, but for even hours after it fell, the light emitted was still too bright to view directly. The newspapers likened it to the blazing rays of the sun, so way too powerful to be endured by human eyes. The following morning, June 7, 1884, the crash site was again visited by many locals, among them E.W. Rawlings, an inspector of cattle brands for the area's ranches. While the wreckage had by then cooled somewhat, it was still too hot to touch. After inspecting the crash site, Rawlings went to the nearby town of Benkelman, Nebraska, and evidently verified that everything Ellis and the other cowboys had claimed was true. While they waited for their amazing find to cool off so they could examine it, Ellis attended the land office to secure the area on which the strange object lay so that his claim to it was beyond dispute. However, disappointingly, in its June 10, 1884 edition, the Daily State Journal reported that the crash debris was, quote, gone, dissolved into the air. A massive rainstorm had fallen the day before, causing all but the paper's correspondent to flee. He waited to see the effect of the torrential downpour upon the glowing mass of metal. The blinding storm lasted for just half an hour, and when it died down so that the UFO should have been visible, it was no longer there. The runoff was 3 feet deep in water, and so, supposing that the strange vessel had floated away, the news team crossed over at the risk of their lives and were astounded to observe that the bizarre object had melted, dissolved by the water as if made of salt, with scarcely a skerrick of it remaining. Small jelly-like pools lay around in various spots on the ground, but before the eyes of the onlookers, these became thinner and thinner until they merged with the muddy storm water. Strangely, the air was pervaded by a faint sweetish smell. Some skeptics insist that this UFO crash is falsely identified because one witness suggested that the wreckage included fragments of cogwheels, which were common machinery mechanisms in the 19th century. However, researchers maintain that he may have just had no other way to describe it. As concluded by the 1884 newspaper, the whole affair is bewildering to the highest degree and will surely forever be a mystery. We add, including without even a site for a dig for modern UFO enthusiasts. Dark disk. A North Texas farmer in 1878 is thought to have coined the term flying saucer after seeing something in the sky that he described as a large saucer. This was the first time in history that the word saucer was used in relation to a UFO. It was early morning on Wednesday, January 2nd, 1878, when the farmer, John Martin, was hunting on his land near Dallas, Texas. Suddenly he observed a dark object in the sky to the south. Initially, the UFO appeared about the size of an orange, but then rapidly grew in size as it approached his location, its peculiar shape and velocity of approach riveting his attention as he strained his eyes to work out what it was. Despite the bright morning sky, the object looked dark, and so it seems that this UFO did not have any lights. Appearing as a dark shape against the bright blue of the sky, it moved rapidly toward Martin, who kept staring at it, remarking later that the UFO appeared to be going through space at wonderful speed. At one stage, the brightness of the sky temporarily blinded the farmer, and he lost track of the object's whereabouts. After resting his eyes for a few moments, by the time he could see once more, the UFO was hovering right on top of him, and it was much larger than he had realised. The later newspaper article stated that when directly above him, it was huge in size and also evidently at a very great height, high up in the sky. This indicated that its true size was even larger than what it appeared to be. Martin described its shape as quite like a balloon, although while hot air balloons were already invented, they were extremely rare and also did not move with any speed. Martin stayed watching the UFO until it moved completely out of sight, leaving as rapidly as it had come. A report about the sighting was published in the Denison Daily News on January 25, 1878. Titled A Strange Phenomenon and relating the first-hand report from the farmer, the article emphasised that Martin was a very trustworthy person who would not make up a false story. It stated, "Mr. Martin is a gentleman of undoubted veracity, and this strange occurrence, if it was not a balloon, deserves the attention of our scientists." In the early 1970s, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, a well-known astronomer and Blue Book Project UFO investigator, studied Martin's sighting. Hynek classified the object sighted as a, quote, daylight disk. These kinds of UFOs often travel very fast and are virtually silent, although some witnesses may hear a very faint swishing sound. They are capable of making sudden sharp turns whilst travelling extremely fast. Daylight disks are often reported as having a shiny or metallic appearance and usually display no lights. Daylight disks were mainly reported after the year 1940, so this very unusual sighting from 1878 is quite an anomaly and remains one of the most intriguing UFO cases of the 1800s.